The town of Sanctuary was a lie spat onto the sun-baked earth of New Mexico. It offered no refuge, only a slow desiccation of the soul under a merciless sky. The year was 1888, and the heat of late summer held the town in its fist, squeezing the last drops of moisture from the cracked adobe and weathered timber. Dust, a fine red powder the color of old blood, coated everything: the sagging porch rails, the thirsty horses at the trough, the very leaves of the stubborn greasewood bushes. It settled in the lines on a person's face and in the quiet corners of their heart. Beyond the last building, the land stretched out into an eternity of rock and sand, watched over by the distant, jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. They stood like silent, blood-red sentinels against the vast, pale blue of the horizon, their sharp edges softened only by the haze of the relentless sun. A dry wind, born somewhere in the desolate plains, was a constant presence. It carried no relief, only grit and the lonely scent of sage. It whispered through the sparse headstones of the town cemetery, a mournful sound that seemed to rise from the parched ground itself. One of those stones, a simple wooden cross already leaning from the wind's persistence, bore the name Jedediah Thorne. It was a grave Miriam never visited. Miriam Thorne rose before the sun, as she had every day for the 2 years since Jedediah's death. The pre-dawn chill was a fleeting mercy, a ghost of coolness that would be banished the moment the sun crested the mountains. Her first act was always the same: to take the worn broom and sweep the porch of her small, isolated cabin at the edge of town. The rhythmic scrape of bristles on wood was the only sound in the gray stillness. It was a futile gesture. By noon, the porch would be coated again in the ubiquitous red dust, but the ritual gave her a purpose, however small, a way to mark the beginning of another empty day. As she swept, she kept her eyes down, but she felt the town behind her, still sleeping, even in its slumber. She felt its judgment. In Sanctuary, she was not a woman. She was a ghost, a shadow that people preferred not to see. When they did look, their eyes were hard and flat, their mouths set in thin lines of disapproval. She was the widow of a man killed by the Apache, and somehow, in the twisted logic of fear and grief, she had become the vessel for the town's bitterness. Her mind, against her will, slipped back to that night 2 years ago, but it felt like a lifetime and yesterday all at once. Jedediah had been a hard man, his hands heavy and his temper fueled by whiskey. His presence had filled the small cabin with a tension as thick as summer heat. Miriam had learned to move quietly, to make herself small, to anticipate the storms that gathered in his dark eyes. That night, the storm had come from outside. It wasn't a raid, not in the way the stories were told. It was a brief, brutal, and confusing clash at the edge of their property line, born from a dispute over a stolen horse that Jedediah had boasted of acquiring. There was shouting in the darkness, his voice, raw and furious, and other voices, guttural and sharp in a language she didn't understand. Then, the single deafening crack of a rifle, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the world. When the men from town arrived, summoned by the gunshot, they found Jedediah lying in the dust, his own rifle still clutched in his hand. They found no one else. The Apache had vanished back into the night, leaving only death behind. They carried Jedediah's body back to the cabin, and as they laid him on the floor, their gazes fell upon Miriam. It started then, the unspoken question hanging in the lantern light. Why here? Why them? What had she done, or not done? Her silence, born of shock and a complicated, guilty relief she dared not name, was mistaken for something else entirely. It was seen as complicity, as a darkness that had invited the violence. Her grief was not the right kind of grief. It was too quiet, too contained. And so, the town decided she was to blame. The whispers followed her like a second shadow. At the general store, conversations would cease when she entered, resuming in hushed tones the moment she turned her back. No one offered a kind word. No one met her eye. She was an outcast, branded by a tragedy she had no part in creating. Every Sunday, she put on her one good dress, a plain gray cotton that had long since faded, and walked to the small white church that stood as the town's moral center. It was an act of penance, though she wasn't sure for what sin. She would enter the cool, dim interior, and a wave of silence would ripple through the congregation. As she walked down the aisle to her customary spot in the back, the pews on either side of her would remain pointedly empty. It was as if a disease clung to her, a spiritual rot that good God-fearing folk were afraid to catch. She would listen to Reverend Miller speak of forgiveness and community, and the hypocrisy of his words was a bitter taste in her mouth. She prayed not for salvation, but for numbness, for the strength to endure one more hour of suffocating isolation before returning to her silent home. There were days the emptiness threatened to consume her. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, pressing in on her until her own thoughts became a deafening roar of despair. She thought of leaving sanctuary, of packing her few meager belongings and walking east until she found a place where the name Thorn meant nothing. But the thought was overwhelming. Where would she go? A lone woman with no family and no money was prey, not a traveler. The world outside sanctuary seemed as vast and unforgiving as the desert that surrounded it. Other, darker thoughts slithered in during the long, cold nights. The thought of simply letting go, of walking out into the desert and not coming back, of letting the current of the shallow creek at the edge of her property pull her under. The idea was not violent, but weary. It was a longing for peace, for an end to the effort of breathing, of sweeping, of enduring. It was a whisper that promised a final, absolute silence. It was on an afternoon steeped in such thoughts that she went to the creek to fetch water. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows from the sparse cottonwood trees that lined the water's edge. The air was cooling, and the world seemed to hold its breath. This creek was her only solace, the one place the town's judgment couldn't seem to reach. The gentle murmur of the water was a comfort. She rounded a bend in the bank, her heavy wooden buckets weighing down her arms, and stopped so abruptly that water sloshed over the rims. A man was sitting on a large, flat rock near the water's edge. He was not one of the town's men. He sat with a stillness that was unnerving, a rootedness to the earth that spoke of a life lived outdoors. He was Apache. His black hair was long, unbound, and his features were sharp, carved as if from the red rock of the mountains themselves. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a worn cotton shirt. He was not armed, at least not visibly, but a formidable strength radiated from him. It was in the set of his broad shoulders, in the powerful lines of his arms. Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. Every story, every whispered warning about the Apache flooded her mind. But then he turned his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark, intense, and filled with a profound sorrow that startled her. It was a sadness she recognized, a deep, abiding ache that mirrored the hollowness within her own chest. And in that gaze, beneath the strength and the sorrow, she saw a flicker of recognition, and she knew him. He looked different now, so much different than the last time she had seen him. He was no longer a broken, feverish body hidden in the thicket behind her cabin. He was strong, powerful, a man in his prime, but the eyes were the same. He rose slowly from the rock, not in a threatening way, but with a deliberate grace. He stood to his full height, a tall, imposing figure against the fading light. Miriam remained frozen, her knuckles white where she gripped the bucket handles. The silence stretched, broken only by the gurgle of the creek and the frantic beating of her own heart. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if sensing her fear. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a riverbed. "I remember this creek," he said, his gaze holding hers. "And the woman who gave me water." His words hung in the cooling air, a bridge across the chasm of years. The name he had not spoken, Dakota, surfaced in her mind, a secret she had kept locked away. Her memory, sharp and sudden, threw her back 3 years, to a time before Jedediah's death, a time of different fears. It had been a sweltering August night. Jedediah was in town, a blessing that meant the whiskey would be someone else's problem until he stumbled home in the early hours. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the air thick and electric with its promise. It was on her way back from the woodpile that she'd heard it, a low groan, the sound of an animal in its final throes. But it wasn't an animal. Hidden in a dense thicket of salt cedar beyond her small, neglected garden, she found him. He was barely a man then, though he was already possessed of that same fierce stillness. He was slumped against the trunk of a tree, his buckskin shirt soaked in a dark, sticky stain. A deep gash ran along his ribs, ugly and inflamed. His face was pale beneath his copper skin, beaded with the sweat of fever. When his eyes opened, they were black pits of pain and suspicion. He tried to move, to reach for a knife at his belt, but the effort left him gasping. Miriam's first instinct was the town's instinct, fear. This was the enemy they spoke of in hushed, angry tones. Jedediah would have shot him on sight and dragged the body to the sheriff as a trophy. The thought of her husband finding him here sent a tremor of ice through her veins. But as she looked at him, huddled in the dirt, his breath coming in ragged pants, she saw not the feared Apache warrior, but a boy, alone and dying. She saw a vulnerability that resonated with a part of herself she kept hidden from everyone, especially her husband. Without a conscious decision, she acted. "Stay," she whispered, a command so quiet it was barely more than a breath. She returned to the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a bucket of clean water, tore strips from an old bedsheet she was meant to be mending, and gathered a handful of yarrow from her herb patch, a plant her mother had taught her would staunch bleeding. Every move was cloaked in terror. She strained her ears for the sound of Jedediah's horse, imagining his rage, the weight of his hand. Back at the thicket, the young man watched her approach with the wary eyes of a cornered wolf. She knelt, setting the supplies down slowly. She didn't speak, knowing that words were useless, perhaps even dangerous. She simply dipped a cloth in the water and held it out. He flinched but allowed her to clean the grime and sweat from his face. She worked silently, cleaning the wound as best she could, her touch gentle but firm. She packed it with the crushed yarrow leaves and bound his ribs tightly with the cloth strips. He endured it all without a sound, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving her face, searching for a sign of the betrayal he surely expected. For 3 nights, she tended to him in secret. Each evening after Jedediah had passed out in his chair, she would slip out with a little food, a piece of bread, some broth, and fresh water. They never spoke. There was no language between them but the language of care. It was a strange, silent communion in the humming darkness. She was the woman who brought healing. He was the man who accepted it. In those quiet moments, she felt more herself than she ever did in the oppressive silence of her own home. There was a simple, undeniable truth to it. A person was hurt, and she was helping. It was a secret act of defiance against the harsh, unforgiving world she lived in, and against the man she was married to. On the 4th morning, he was gone. There was no sign he had ever been there, except for a single, perfect hawk's feather left on the flattened earth where he had lain. Now, standing by the creek, the memory was so vivid it was as if no time had passed at all. The boy was gone, and in his place stood this man, Dakota. The lean frame had filled out with hard muscle, and his face held the lines of a life lived hard. But the eyes were the same, and they held the memory of her secret kindness. "The years have not been good," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. He told her then, in short, clipped sentences, of a life spent on the run. He spoke of his people being pushed from their lands, of the treaties broken one by one. He spoke of the fighting, and of the weariness that came after. He had tried to walk the white man's path for a time, working for a rancher far to the south, but he was met with suspicion and contempt. He returned to his own people, but he had been away too long. He had the scent of the white world on him, and they too looked at him with distrust. He belonged nowhere. He was a ghost, like her, but his wilderness was the entire world. To them, he said, his gaze drifting toward the distant lights of sanctuary, I will always be the enemy, the savage, and to some of my own, I am a traitor who has forgotten the old ways. The wound he spoke of now was not one she could bind with cloth and herbs. It was a deep, internal bleeding of the soul. Miriam listened, her own troubles momentarily forgotten, absorbed by the stark reality of his. Her isolation was a cage built by a town's prejudice. His was a desert with no borders. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. A sudden chill crept into the air, the swift and biting cold of the desert night. She saw him shiver, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, and a primal, protective instinct stirred within her. The words left her lips before she could think, a clumsy offering against the encroaching darkness. "It's late," she said, her voice sounding small and foreign to her own ears. "The night gets cold. You could come back for dinner." Dakota looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had asked for nothing, expected nothing. Her invitation was a complication, a risk for them both. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse, that he would simply nod and melt back into the shadows from which he had come. But he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I would be grateful." The walk back to the cabin was thick with a silence that was entirely different from the one she was used to. It was not empty, it was filled with 1,000 unspoken things. He walked a few paces behind her, a silent guardian, and she was acutely aware of his presence, of the solid, living warmth of him in the growing dark. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. She lit the lantern, and the small room was cast in a warm, flickering glow that made the shadows dance in the corners. The space was still haunted by the memory of Jedediah, by years of fear and loneliness. Now, this stranger's presence filled it, changing its very atmosphere. She moved about the familiar tasks of preparing a meal, her hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years. It was only salt pork and beans, the same meager fare she ate every night, but tonight it felt like a feast. Dakota sat at the small wooden table, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He did not speak, but he watched her every move, his dark eyes taking in the worn floorboards, the sparsely filled shelves, the quiet desperation of her life. The meal was an exercise in tension. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against the tin plates and the crackle of the fire she had built in the hearth. Miriam kept her eyes fixed on her food, but she could feel his gaze on her. She risked a glance and found him looking at her, a question in his eyes she couldn't answer. She looked away quickly, a flush of heat rising in her cheeks. It was an intimacy more potent than any touch, to be seen, truly seen. After years of being invisible, she was trying so hard to maintain her distance, to remember who he was, who she was, the grieving widow, the town pariah. But with every passing second of this shared silence, a part of her that had been frozen for years began to thaw. A dangerous curiosity bloomed in her chest, a fragile sense of life stirring in the barren landscape of her heart. When they finished, he helped her clear the plates, his movements economical and precise. They stood near the hearth, the small space between them charged with an energy that was both frightening and exhilarating. The purpose of the evening was done. The meal was over. The cold was held at bay. Now, he must go. He turned to face her fully. "Thank you for the meal, Miriam," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange and new in his low voice. "You are welcome," she replied, her voice a near whisper. He moved toward the door, and the spell was broken. In a moment, he would be gone. The door would close, and the silence would rush back in, colder and more profound than ever before. The emptiness that awaited her was a physical thing, a monster she could no longer bear to face alone. Panic, raw and desperate, clawed its way up her throat. He put his hand on the latch. "Wait!" The word was torn from her, sharp with a pain she hadn't realized she was holding. He stopped, his back still to her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The truth, the simple, terrible truth of her existence, spilled out of her in a broken whisper, a prayer to a man who was as lost as she was. "I don't want to live alone anymore." Dakota didn't turn around, not at first. He stood perfectly still, his hand frozen on the door. Then, slowly, he turned his head, and his eyes met hers across the small, lantern-lit room. The sorrow was still there, but it was joined now by something else, a flicker of an emotion so fierce and complex it stole the breath from her lungs. It was not pity, it was understanding. It was the reflection of her own desperate plea in the eyes of the only person in the world who could possibly comprehend it. He did not stay the night, after her whispered confession hung in the air between them. He had simply held her gaze for a heart-stopping moment, then given a single, solemn nod before slipping out into the darkness, closing the door so softly she barely heard it click. Miriam was left alone with the echo of her own vulnerability, a feeling so raw it was like a fresh wound. She expected to feel shame in the morning light, the familiar, bitter regret that followed any display of weakness. But when she woke, the first thing she noticed was a profound silence where the wind's rattle should have been. The loose board on the fence no longer knocked against its post. She rose and went to the door, pulling it open to a world washed clean by the cool pre-dawn air. There, neatly stacked against the cabin wall, was a pile of firewood, split and dry, enough to last a week. Her eyes followed a set of footprints in the dust leading from the wood pile to the corner of her property, where the section of fence that had been battered loose by the last sandstorm now stood straight and sturdy, mended with skill and care. He had come back, while she slept. He had returned and worked in the darkness, leaving behind these silent gifts before disappearing again. A hot flush of anger surged through her. It was pity. He had seen her desperation and pitied her. The thought was a humiliation, a branding that felt hotter than the town's scorn. For 2 years, she had survived. She had chopped her own wood, fetched her own water, and borne her loneliness like a shroud. But it was hers. She did not need a man's charity, especially not his. She stalked to the fence, her jaw tight, ready to tear the mended boards apart with her bare hands, to reject this silent offering and the weakness it implied. But as her fingers touched the smooth, repaired wood, the anger faltered. This wasn't the clumsy work of a man seeking thanks. It was quiet, efficient, and unobtrusive. It was not an act of pity, she realized, but an act of understanding. He hadn't offered platitudes or promises. He had seen a need and met it. He had answered her cry of loneliness not with words, but with work. He had made her small corner of the world a little safer, a little warmer. The anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it made her knees weak. She leaned her forehead against the fence post, and for the first time since Jedediah's death, she wept. Not tears of grief or self-pity, but of a strange and overwhelming gratitude. He came back that afternoon, appearing at the edge of her property as quietly as a shadow. He didn't approach the cabin, but began clearing the stubborn, thorny weeds from her neglected garden patch. Miriam watched him from the window for a long time before she took a deep breath, filled a dipper with fresh water, and walked out to him. She offered it without a word, and he took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The brief touch was like a spark on dry tinder. "The ground is hard," he said, his voice as low and steady as the earth itself. "It has had no care for a long time," she replied. And so it began. They started to talk, their stories unfolding slowly, cautiously. In the shared space of the passing days, he would work in the garden, and she would sit nearby, mending a shirt or shelling beans. The rhythm of their separate tasks creating a shared, peaceful industry. He told her of his family, his words painting a picture of a life she could barely imagine, of a community bound by traditions as old as the mountains. He spoke of his younger sister, Nita, whose laughter he said was like the sound of pebbles in a running stream. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, not since his family was moved to the reservation 100 miles south. They were told it was for their own good, he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands never ceasing their work of pulling weeds. Good land, they were promised, but the land is barren, and the spirit grows barren with it. He had left, unable to watch his father, a proud warrior, reduced to accepting government rations. That act of leaving had branded him. To the soldiers, he was just another renegade Apache. To his father, he was a son who had abandoned his people in their darkest hour. Miriam, in turn, began to give voice to the shape of her own solitude. She spoke not of Jedediah, that was a box of memories too dark and complex to open, but of the silence that came after. In the winter, she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sky bleed red and gold. The silence has a weight. It's so heavy, some nights I think it will crush the life from me. I started talking to myself, just to hear a voice. Then I stopped, because I was afraid I was going mad. She confessed the feeling of being an invisible burden on the town, a constant, unwelcome reminder of violence and loss. It is a strange thing, she mused, her voice barely a whisper, to feel like a ghost before you have even died. As they shared these broken pieces of themselves, the landscape around them seemed to listen, reflecting their moods. The vast, indifferent sky mirrored the scope of their loneliness. The sharp, unforgiving edges of the Red Rock Mountains were like the jagged edges of their pasts. When they spoke of loss, the wind would moan through the canyons, a mournful chorus to their words. As they worked side by side in the garden, their two long shadows stretched and merged on the cracked, thirsty ground, becoming one in the dying light of the afternoon. They fell into a routine that was as natural as breathing. He would arrive in the morning and work on the small homestead, replastering a crack in the adobe wall, sharpening her worn axe, turning the soil in the garden until it was soft and yielding. Miriam would prepare a simple midday meal, and they would eat together. The silence between them no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. The presence of another human being engaged in the simple acts of living, of eating, of working, of resting, was a balm to her starved soul. She found herself smiling, a small, rusty movement of her lips that felt both strange and wonderful. One night, the weather broke, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. A smell so rare in that dry land it felt like a miracle. Dark clouds, the color of slate, rolled in from the west, swallowing the stars. The first drops fell with a soft hiss in the dust, then more, until it became a steady, drumming rhythm on the cabin's tin roof. It was the first real rain in months. Miriam stood inside, listening to the sound. It was a cleansing, a washing away of the endless dust and the stagnant heat. It was the sound of life. She knew Dakota would not be out in the open. He would have found shelter in the small, lean-to shed where she kept her tools, but an impulse, a need to share this moment with him, pulled her to the door. She opened it to a world of gray, streaming rain and the clean, sharp smell of creosote, and he was there, not in the shed, but sitting on the edge of her porch, his back against a post, watching the storm. He was soaked, his black hair slicked to his head, his cotton shirt clinging to the powerful lines of his chest and shoulders. He didn't seem to mind the rain. He seemed to be a part of it, as elemental and untamed as the storm itself. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The roof overhead offered a small circle of sanctuary from the downpour. She didn't speak, just stood near the opposite post, following his gaze out into the deluge. The rain fell in a solid, shimmering curtain, turning the hard-packed earth to dark, thirsty mud. It was a wild and beautiful symphony, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence she had lived in for so long. He must have felt her presence, but he didn't turn. They stayed that way for a long time, two silent figures on a lonely porch, listening to the heartbeat of the storm. The world was reduced to this small space, to the sound of the rain and the presence of each other. Finally, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes found hers through the gloom. The flickering lantern light from inside the cabin cast a faint glow on his face, illuminating the raindrops on his skin. In his dark eyes, she saw the wildness of the storm, but she also saw a deep, aching stillness. It was a gaze that stripped away every pretense, every fear, every wall she had ever built around her heart. It asked for nothing, and it offered everything. Miriam couldn't look away. Her breath caught in her throat. In that long, silent look, something shifted forever. The fragile bridge of shared words and tentative trust they had built over the past days solidified into something stronger, something deeper and far more dangerous. It was a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer just two lonely souls sharing a space, but two halves of a pain that had, impossibly, found its match. The rain beat down on the roof, but the storm that was gathering between them was far more powerful. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world drenched and gleaming under a sky of bruised indigo. The days that followed were charged with the memory of that night on the porch, with the weight of the look that had passed between them. The air in the small cabin, once empty and cold, was now thick with a palpable tension, a hum of unspoken possibility that was both terrifying and intoxicating. They moved around each other with a new, careful awareness. Every accidental brush of hands as they worked, every shared glance across the dinner table, was a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which they stood. One evening, the silence was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of companionship, but a heavy, waiting silence. They had finished their simple meal of rabbit stew, and the hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Miriam rose to clear the table, her movement stiff and self-conscious. Dakota was holding the small wooden bowl they used for washing, and as she reached for it, her hand brushed against his forearm. It was not a fleeting touch. It was as if the world stopped on that single point of contact. His skin was warm, alive, the muscles beneath hard as seasoned oak. Her fingers, instead of recoiling, lingered. She felt a jolt, a current of heat that shot up her arm and spread through her entire body, waking every nerve that had been dormant for years. She looked up, and his dark eyes were already on her, blazing with an intensity that mirrored the fire in her own veins. He did not move. He simply turned his arm slightly, his fingers gently closing around her wrist. A silent question. Her breath hitched. The bowl was forgotten. In his eyes, she saw not just desire, but a reflection of her own profound loneliness, a hunger for connection that went deeper than the flesh. It was the call of one broken soul to another. The years of isolation, of being untouched, unseen, and unloved, crested within her like a tidal wave. All the fear, all the town's judgment, all the ghosts of her past, faded to a distant murmur. There was only this man, this moment, and this overwhelming, terrifying need. Slowly, as if moving through water, he leaned in. She met him halfway, rising on her toes. Their first kiss was not gentle or practiced. It was a desperate, clumsy collision of lips and breath, trembling with years of pent-up sorrow and longing. It was the taste of wood smoke and rain, of salt from the tears she didn't realize were falling down her cheeks. It was a raw, aching confession of need, a frantic search for solace in the darkness. For a fleeting, beautiful instant. She was not a widow. He was not an Apache. They were simply a man and a woman. finding a desperate sanctuary in each other's arms. But the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Reality, cold and brutal, crashed back in. The face of Jedediah, contorted in a drunken rage, flashed behind her eyes. The whispers of the church ladies, sharp and venomous, echoed in her ears. What was she doing? This was a sin. This was a betrayal. This was madness. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and she tore herself away from him, stumbling backward until her back hit the rough cabin wall. "No!" she gasped. The word ripped from her throat. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking uncontrollably. "I can't. We mustn't." The words were a frantic prayer against the very feelings that were consuming her. She was terrified, not of him, but of the monumental, life-altering power of what had just happened. Dakota did not move toward her. He remained by the table, his face a mask of stone in the flickering firelight, but his chest rose and fell with the force of his own ragged breaths. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, shared pain. He saw her fear, her guilt, her panic, and he did not judge it. He understood it. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough whisper that cut through her hysteria. "I am afraid to, Miriam." The admission stunned her into silence. The idea that this strong, self-sufficient man could feel the same terror that was gripping her seemed impossible. "But I will wait," he finished quietly. He held her gaze for another moment, a silent promise of patience. Then he turned and slipped out the door, leaving her alone with the ghost of his touch on her lips and the tumultuous storm in her heart. The days that followed were a quiet agony. A new, more difficult wall rose between them. They avoided each other's eyes. They worked on opposite sides of the small property, the space between them humming with a tension so thick she could feel it on her skin. When they had to speak, their words were clipped and formal, stripped of the easy intimacy that had been growing between them. But the avoidance was a lie. Every time his back was to her, she found her eyes drawn to the powerful lines of his shoulders. Every time she heard his quiet footsteps approaching, her heart would leap into her throat. A simple touch, passing a tool or a plate of food, was now an event, a brief, electric shock that left them both trembling in its wake. The world had shrunk, and then it had been charged with a dangerous, unspoken current. The longing did not fade. It grew, festered, and coiled in the silence. One night, the ghost she had been running from finally caught her. She fell into a deep, troubled sleep and found herself back in this cabin. But it was not her cabin anymore. It belonged to Jedediah again. He was there, his face bloated and red, smelling of whiskey and stale sweat. He wasn't hitting her in the dream, but his presence was a physical weight, his voice a low, constant rumble of criticism and contempt that filled the small space, leaving no room for her to breathe. He was mocking her work in the garden, sneering at her mended dress, his words twisting into her like sharp little knives. She was small, useless, and utterly trapped. She woke with a silent scream lodged in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat. She sat bolt upright, tangled in her thin blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. The cabin was pitch black, but his oppressive presence lingered in the air, so real she could almost smell the whiskey. She was shaking, a deep, bone-rattling tremor she couldn't control. She was alone in the dark, and she had never felt more terrified. A floorboard creaked outside her bedroom door. Her blood ran cold, but it was a slow, deliberate sound, not the clumsy stumble of a drunk. A dark shape filled the doorway, a silhouette against the fainter dark of the main room. It was Dakota. He must have been sleeping on the porch and heard her cry out. He didn't speak. He didn't light a lamp. He simply walked to the side of her bed and knelt on the floor, a quiet, solid presence in the terrifying darkness. He waited, letting the silence settle, letting her frantic heartbeat begin to slow. Then, he reached out and gently took her hand. His hand was large, calloused, and blessedly warm. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a slow, steady rhythm. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply stayed, sharing the darkness with her, his quiet strength a shield against the phantoms of her past. The shaking began to subside, replaced by great, shuddering sobs she could no longer hold back. They were the tears of 2 years of fear and grief she had never allowed herself to shed. Still, he said nothing. He just held her hand, a steady, unwavering point in her collapsing world. When her tears finally lessened to quiet, hiccuping breaths, he moved. He rose from the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. Then, gently, carefully, he drew her toward him. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around her. Miriam stiffened for a second, a reflexive reaction born of a long habit. But then she collapsed against him. This was nothing like Jedediah's embraces, which had been possessive and crushing. This was different. This was a shelter. She rested her head against his chest, and she could hear the slow, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the steadiest, most reassuring sound she had ever heard. His arms were strong, but they were a protective circle, not a cage. He smelled of the night air and clean earth. He held her as if she were something precious, something to be protected, not possessed. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her memory, a feeling of absolute, profound peace settled over her. The ghosts retreated, the fear dissolved, the crushing weight of her loneliness lifted. In the arms of this silent, watchful man, this outcast, this enemy of her people, Miriam Thorne finally felt safe. She felt, for the very first time, that she had come home that night. Miriam slept a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in 2 years. She woke not to the familiar specter of fear, but to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through her window and the lingering feeling of a protective warmth. Dakota was gone from her room, but his presence remained, a quiet strength that had driven the ghosts from the corners. When she stepped into the main room, she found him sitting by the cold hearth, keeping watch. He simply nodded, his eyes asking the question his lips did not form. She answered with the smallest, most fragile of smiles. It was the first true smile to touch her lips in years, and it felt like a thaw after a long, brutal winter. A profound shift occurred after that night. The invisible wall of tension and fear between them did not just crumble, it vanished as if it had never been. The cabin, once a tomb of sorrowful memories, began to feel like a home. A subtle energy returned to Miriam, a light in her eyes that had long been extinguished. She began to sing softly to herself as she worked, old forgotten hymns and folk songs her mother had taught her. She started baking bread again, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the small space, a scent of life and nourishment that chased away the last vestiges of staleness and despair. She would insist Dakota stay for the midday meal, and then for the evening one as well. Their shared dinners were no longer silent trials, but islands of quiet communion in the vastness of the desert. Their days found a new, shared rhythm, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. It was a season of rebuilding, both inside and out. The small, dilapidated granary at the edge of the property, its roof caved in and its walls leaning, became their first project. They worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient team. He, with his raw strength, would lift the heavy, weathered beams into place. She, with a surprising dexterity, would hammer the nails straight and true. There was an easy grace to their partnership. He would anticipate the tool she needed, placing it in her hand without a word. She would know when he needed water, appearing at his side with a full dipper before he had to ask. The rhythmic sound of their hammer blows echoed across the silent land, a declaration of intent, a reclaiming of a life that had been left to decay. After the granary stood straight and strong once more, they turned to the fences. replacing the rotten posts and stretching new wire until the entire homestead was enclosed in a neat, protective boundary. And then came the garden, the patch of earth that had been her secret shame, choked with weeds and baked hard by the sun, became their focus. Together, they turned the soil, their shovels breaking up the hard, unforgiving ground. They worked in compost, cleared the stones, and carved neat rows into the dark, rich earth. He showed her how to plant seeds the way his people did, not too deep, with a prayer for life whispered over each one. As they poured their labor into the land itself seemed to respond. The world around them, so long a palette of reds and browns, began to soften. A tenacious, pale green fuzz appeared on the hillsides after the rain. Tiny, vibrant purple flowers, no bigger than a thumbnail, began to push their way up through the cracks in the rocks. It was an early, improbable spring, a quiet miracle of life asserting itself against the odds. Miriam felt it in her own soul, a tentative, hopeful greening in the barren soil of her heart. The world was coming back to life, and so was she. The physical closeness of their work wove a new kind of intimacy between them. The fear and hesitation that had defined their first touches were replaced by a comfortable, implicit trust. A hand on her back to steady her as she climbed a ladder, his fingers brushing hers as they both reached for the same seed packet. These were no longer jolts of electricity, but quiet affirmations of their bond. The longing that had once been a source of terror was now a steady, warming fire at the core of her being. She no longer feared it. She cherished it. One evening, they finished their work as the sun began its spectacular descent. It was a sunset of impossible beauty. The entire western sky set ablaze in streaks of fiery orange, deep rose, and molten gold. The light poured over the landscape, softening the harsh edges of the mountains and painting the desert floor in hues of otherworldly splendor. They stood side by side, watching the celestial display, their shoulders barely touching. The day's work was done. The garden was planted. The granary was whole. A profound sense of peace and accomplishment settled over them. In that magnificent, silent moment, the waiting was over. He turned to her, his face cast in the warm, golden light. His dark eyes held a question that was as old as time, a deep, reverent wanting that made her breath catch. There was no fear left in her, no guilt, no ghost of the past. There was only this man, whose quiet patience had healed her, whose gentle strength had made her feel safe. She gave him her answer not with words, but by lifting her hand and gently tracing the line of his jaw. It was all the invitation he needed. He led her inside the cabin as the last light of day faded to a deep twilight. He did not lead her to the bedroom, the room that still held the coldest of her memories, but to the main room, in front of the warm, crackling hearth. There, on a soft blanket spread before the fire, they came together. It was a slow, tender exploration, a sacred act of discovery. For Miriam, it was as if it were the first time. Every touch was a revelation, so starkly different from the rough, impatient fumblings of her marriage. His hands were not demanding, but questioning. They moved over her with a reverence that made her want to weep, mapping the curve of her waist, the line of her throat, as if she were a fragile, priceless thing. He was unhurried, his touch a gentle balm on the old, invisible scars she carried. There was an awkwardness to it, a sweet, fumbling vulnerability as two people who had been profoundly alone learned the geography of one another. But beneath it was a fierce, desperate passion, the culmination of all their shared loneliness, their silent conversations, their unspoken understanding. It was the hunger of two starved souls finally being allowed to feast. When they finally came together, it was not a taking, but a mutual surrender, a quiet, powerful collision that was both a homecoming and a new beginning. She met his fierce tenderness with her own, a wild, soaring release of a passion she never knew she possessed. In the firelight, in his arms, She was not broken. She was not a pariah. She was whole. She was alive. She was cherished. Later, they lay tangled together in the warm glow of the dying embers, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely tender. She looked at him, truly looked at him, at the strength and the sorrow and the profound kindness in his face, and her heart felt as if it would burst with an emotion for which she had no name. They did not speak of love. They did not make promises for a future they knew was uncertain. The world outside this cabin, with all its hatred and prejudice, had not gone away. But in the quiet, sacred space they had created, it had no power. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, he stirred. She woke to find him watching her, a soft, unreadable expression in his eyes. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a silent seal on the covenant their bodies had made. She reached up, her fingers tracing the hawk feather tattoo on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had begun so long ago. There was no need for words. In the quiet language of looks and soft, lingering touches, they had admitted everything. They had found each other in the wasteland, and for now, in this small, improbable sanctuary. That was enough. The sanctuary they had built was a fragile thing, a house of glass in a world of stones. For a few precious weeks, their small, reclaimed homestead was the entire world. But the world outside their mended fences had not forgotten them, and its judgment was merely gathering its strength. A town like Sanctuary thrives on a diet of whispers, and the whispers about the widow Thorne had begun to change. It started with a sighting. A ranch hand, riding the perimeter of his employer's property, saw the Apache working in the widow's garden, his bare back gleaming with sweat in the midday sun. The story was in the saloon by nightfall. It was embellished by Mr. Henderson at the general store, who noted that Miriam Thorne no longer looked like a ghost when she came for supplies. She had a light in her eyes, and she bought more flour than a woman living alone would ever need. The women of the town, fanning themselves on their porches, connected the dots with the sharp, cruel needle of sanctimonious gossip. The Apache hadn't just been seen near her property. He was living there. The widow, they hissed over their teacups, was keeping a savage in her home. The rumor spread like a fever, infecting every corner of the town. The first official blow came on a Tuesday morning. The sun was bright, the sky a flawless, unforgiving blue. Miriam was humming as she kneaded bread dough, the simple, domestic act a source of quiet joy. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door made her hands freeze. It was not Dakota's soft, familiar rap. This was a summons. Wiping the flour from her hands, she opened the door to find Reverend Miller standing on her porch. He was a tall, severe man, his face a mask of pious disapproval. He stood in his crisp black coat, the sun glinting off his spectacles, looking utterly out of place against the backdrop of her rustic, handmade repairs. "Mrs. Thorne," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I have come as a shepherd to a lost sheep. The talk in town has become impossible to ignore." Miriam said nothing, simply stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her. She would not invite him in. "You are a woman of God," he continued, his tone shifting from stern to condescending. "A member of my flock. It is my duty to guide you back from this path of sin and degradation. To shelter an unbaptized savage is one thing, a misguided act of charity, perhaps, but to live with him, to share your home and, one presumes, your affections. It is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord, and a betrayal of your own people." He gestured vaguely toward the cemetery. "It is a stain upon the memory of your late husband, a good Christian man." The mention of Jedediah, of that false, public memory of him, was a bitter pill. A hot, angry retort rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. What was the use? This man's mind was as hard and barren as the desert rock. Instead, tears of pure, helpless frustration welled in her eyes, blurring his righteous face. She did not sob or crumble, but stood her ground, the tears tracing clean paths through the dusting of flour on her cheeks.
"My life is my own. Reverend,"
she managed to say, her voice trembling but firm. "And my soul is a matter between myself and God, not you." "Your soul is in mortal peril, woman!" he thundered, his piety giving way to raw anger. "You have chosen the company of a heathen over your own kind. You have forsaken your faith and your race." It was then that a floorboard creaked behind Miriam. Dakota emerged from the shadows of the cabin's main room, coming to a stop directly behind her. He was shirtless, his chest and arms gleaming from his work in the garden. He was a solid, undeniable presence, his face impassive, but his eyes as hard and dangerous as obsidian. He said nothing. He did not need to. His very existence was a challenge. He placed a hand gently on Miriam's shoulder, a silent declaration of ownership, of partnership, of protection. It was the first time he had shown himself, the first time he had publicly claimed his place at her side. Reverend Miller recoiled as if struck. He stared at Dakota's hand on Miriam's shoulder, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The sight of them together, a united front, was more offensive to him than any rumor. He sputtered, his sermon of condemnation lost in a wave of pure, unadulterated hatred. "May God have mercy on you both," he finally spat. The words a curse, not a prayer. He turned on his heel and stalked away, his back rigid with fury. The town was now officially divided. There were those who followed the Reverend's lead, whose fear and prejudice were given a holy sanction. Their glares were open and venomous. They would cross the street to avoid walking on the same side as Miriam. Insults were hissed just loud enough for her to hear as she passed. Then there were the others, a quieter faction. They were the ones who had known hardship, who looked at Miriam with a silent, sorrowful pity in their eyes. They offered no help, no words of support. They were too afraid of the town's judgment to stand with her, but in their averted gazes, she saw a flicker of empathy. It was a cold comfort, but it was something. The world had drawn a line in the dust, and she and Dakota stood on one side, with the rest of Sanctuary on the other. The hatred, now sanctioned, festered, and one moonless night, it boiled over. Miriam and Dakota were asleep when the first rock crashed through the window. The sound of shattering glass was an explosion in the deep quiet of the cabin. Miriam woke with a scream, her heart instantly pounding with a primal terror, before she could even process what had happened. Dakota was out of the bed, a dark, fluid shadow in the night. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. Another rock hit the wall with a heavy thud, followed by the sound of drunken, jeering laughter from outside. A torrent of slurred, ugly words filled the night air. They were shouting at her, calling her names that made her flinch, accusing her of betraying her race for a savage. They shouted at him, their voices thick with a venomous hatred that needed no reason. Dakota did not go to the door. He did not pick up the rifle that was always propped in the corner. His only concern was her. He came to her side, pulling her from the bed and down onto the floor. Below the level of the windows, "We go to the kitchen," he whispered, his body shielding hers as they crawled from the room. The kitchen was at the back of the cabin and had no windows. It was the safest place. They huddled together on the cold floorboards as the assault continued. More rocks hit the walls. Heavy boots stomped on the porch, and a fist hammered on the door, the wood groaning under the force. The shouted insults were a constant, chaotic barrage of hate. Miriam buried her face in Dakota's chest, her body shaking with a terror that was deeper and colder than anything she had ever felt. This was not the contained, personal fear she had felt with Jedediah. This was the terrifying, impersonal hatred of a mob. It was the sound of the world wanting to tear them apart. Dakota held her, his arms a circle of solid strength around her. He was preternaturally calm, his body tense but his breathing steady. He was listening, assessing the threat, but he made no move to retaliate. He was a warrior, she knew. He could have slipped out the back and dealt with these drunken fools in the darkness with a deadly efficiency. But he did not. He chose to stay, to absorb the hatred. His entire being focused on the single, vital task of keeping her safe. He held her head against his chest, murmuring soft, guttural words in his own language, a calming rhythm against the storm of hate outside. After what felt like an eternity, the noises began to fade. The shouts grew more distant, the laughter receding as the cowardly mob, having spent their drunken rage, retreated back to the town. The silence that fell in their wake was immense, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the shattered window pane and Miriam's own ragged, shuddering sobs. They remained on the floor for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms. The immediate danger had passed, but the poison of it remained. The sanctuary was broken. The hatred was not a distant thing anymore. It was here, on their porch, in their home. Miriam finally lifted her head, her face wet with tears, and looked at him in the deep gloom. The reality of their situation, the sheer, crushing weight of it, settled upon her.
"Can we live like this, Dakota?"
she whispered, her voice broken. "Hiding in our own home, waiting for the next rock, the next fist at the door. Will it ever end?" He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the darkness, but she could feel the tension in his arms. He was seeing the future as clearly as she was. A life under siege, a constant battle against a world that would never accept them. He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, she felt the fragile hope of the past weeks begin to die. But when he spoke, his voice was not one of defeat. It was quiet, steady, and filled with a resolve that seemed to push back the darkness. "If you wish it, I will take you away from here," he said, his words measured and clear. "We can go north, into the mountains. Find a place where no one knows our names. I will do that for you." Her heart sank. It was an admission that it was hopeless. But then he continued, his grip on her tightening, his voice dropping to an intense, powerful whisper. "But I want to stay," he said. "This is the first place I have not been a ghost. I want to stay. For you." His words, spoken into the heart of her fear, were not a comfort. They were a challenge. "I want to stay. For you." This was not a desire for shelter, but a declaration of intent. In the harsh light of the morning, surrounded by the evidence of the town's hatred, the glittering shards of glass on the floor, the ugly dents in the wooden walls, Dakota's resolve had solidified into a plan. It was a plan so audacious, so contrary to the way of his world and hers, that it terrified her more than the rocks in the night. He would not run. He would not hide. He would walk into the lion's den and demand to be seen. "There is a man," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding as they swept up the last of the glass. "The soldier chief, the captain. He is the one who speaks for the white man's law in this territory." Miriam's heart went cold. "Captain Davies? Dakota? No, he is a hard man. He sees your people as a problem to be managed, not as men. And that is how they see me now," he countered, his logic as sharp and straight as an arrow. "A shadow, a ghost, a problem hiding on your land. A shadow can be chased away. A man with a paper from the soldier chief. He is a different kind of problem. He is a man who must be looked at." He was going to present himself to the U.S. Army detachment quartered in Sanctuary, to Captain Davies, and ask for legal permission to reside on her property. He was seeking to use the very law that had been used to dispossess his people as a shield to protect his new life. It was a fool's errand, a lamb walking before wolves, and she told him so. She begged him to reconsider, to take her away as he'd offered, to flee to the mountains where they could be ghosts together, but free. "To be a ghost with you is better than to be a ghost alone," he said, taking her hands in his. "But I did not save you from one kind of prison, only to build another for us in the wilderness. I will not have you live in fear of every rider, every distant shout. This is your home. If we are to stay, we must stand in the light." She saw then that his mind was made up. This was his form of battle, not with a rifle, but with his own presence. It was an act of profound courage, and of a love for her so deep it was willing to risk total humiliation and defeat. And if he was brave enough to face them, she would have to be brave enough to stand beside him. The hearing, as it came to be called, was not held in a formal courthouse. Captain Davies, a man whose patience had been worn thin by years of service in a land he despised, saw no need for such formalities. He convened the meeting in the largest room in town, the saloon. By mid-morning, the tables had been pushed to the walls, and the air, already thick with the stale smells of whiskey and sawdust, was now charged with a cauldron of resentment and morbid curiosity. Nearly everyone of consequence was there. Reverend Miller sat in the front row, his Bible resting on his knee like a weapon. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of worried disapproval. A group of young, swaggering cowboys, the same ones. Miriam was certain from the other night, leaned against the bar, their spurs jingling with a nervous energy, their faces a mixture of bravado and guilt. And in the center of it all, seated behind the main poker table as if it were a judge's bench, was Captain Davies. He was a man in his 50s, with a weathered face, a drooping gray mustache, and tired, cynical eyes that had seen too much senseless violence. To him, this was not a matter of justice. It was an administrative headache, an interruption to his routine of reports and patrols. When Miriam and Dakota entered, a wave of hostile silence fell over the room. Every eye turned to them. They walked through the Isle of Glares, a solitary island in a sea of contempt. Miriam's hands were trembling, but she held her head high. Dakota was a study in stillness. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his face impassive, his gaze fixed on the captain. He wore a clean cotton shirt and buckskin trousers, but to the people in that room, he might as well have been in war paint. He was the savage, the other, the source of all their fears. Captain Davies gestured to two simple chairs placed before his table. "State your purpose," he said, his voice flat and impatient. It was Dakota who spoke, his English careful and clear. "I am Dakota. I wish for a paper that says I can live on the property of Mrs. Miriam Thorne. I will not make trouble. I will work the land." A snort of derisive laughter came from the cowboys at the bar. Captain Davies silenced them with a single, weary glare. He looked from Dakota to Miriam. "Mrs. Thorne, is this your wish, that this man reside with you?" The way he said man made it sound like an infestation. Before Miriam could answer, Reverend Miller rose to his feet. "Captain, I must speak for the moral soul of this community. This is a scandal of the highest order. This woman has taken a heathen into her home, shaming the memory of her husband and defying the laws of God and man. To grant this request would be to sanction depravity. It would endanger every good Christian family in this town." Mr. Henderson spoke up from the back. "It's bad for business. Captain, people are uneasy. They're scared. Having him here, it just stirs up trouble." The accusations continued, a chorus of prejudice disguised as civic concern. They spoke of Dakota as if he were not there, referring to him as the Apache, the savage. Him. Through it all, Dakota remained silent, his expression unchanging, his dignity a silent rebuke to their vitriol. Finally, Captain Davies held up a hand for silence. He looked at Miriam, his eyes cold and assessing. "Mrs. Thorne, you have heard the concerns of your neighbors. What say you?" This was it, her moment, her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, and she had to clear her throat to be heard. "What they say is not the truth," she began, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces before landing back on the captain. Not the whole truth. She took a deep breath, and the story poured out of her. She told them of the night 3 years ago when she found Dakota bleeding and near death. A boy then, not a man. She told them of her secret act of mercy, of cleaning his wound and bringing him water in the dark, all while her own husband was away. "I saved his life," she said, her voice growing stronger, imbued with the power of her conviction. It was a simple act of Christian charity, Reverend, the kind you preach about every Sunday but seem to forget during the week. A murmur went through the room. This was a detail none of them had known. "And now," she continued, turning to look directly at Dakota, her heart in her eyes, "he has saved mine." She told them of her life after Jedediah's death, of the crushing loneliness, the silent despair, the feeling of being a ghost in her own town. She spoke with a raw, unflinching honesty that stunned the room into a deeper silence. "You all looked at me, but you never saw me," she said, her gaze now moving from one familiar, hostile face to another. "You saw the widow of a man killed by the Apache, and you blamed me for it. You left me to rot in my grief. My fences were falling, my spirit was failing, and my soul was dying of thirst. This man," she placed a hand on Dakota's arm, "this man came back. He did not come as an enemy. He came and he mended my fences. He chopped my wood. He helped me plant a garden in soil that everyone, including me, had given up for dead. He saved me not from a knife or a bullet, but from a quiet, lonely death of the spirit. He gave me back my life." Her voice cracked on the last words. But she did not weep. She stood straight and proud, her hand resting on Dakota's arm, their two disparate lives now irrevocably entwined in her public testimony. The saloon was utterly still. No one had an answer for her truth. It was too personal, too powerful. Even Captain Davies looked discomfited, his cynical gaze faltering for just a moment. It was into this thick, unresolved silence that the world outside began to scream. A low moan of wind quickly escalated into a high-pitched shriek. The bright sunlight outside the saloon doors was suddenly extinguished, replaced by a sickly, churning yellow gloom. A sandstorm. It hit the town with the force of a physical blow, a furious, elemental rage. Sand and dust blasted against the building, finding its way through every crack, and a sudden, premature twilight fell over the room. The men inside jumped to their feet, shouting to bar the doors and shutter the windows. The hearing was forgotten, chaos erupting as nature's fury dwarfed their petty human squabbles. In the confusion, Miriam and Dakota rose and made their way to the door. As they stepped outside, the storm engulfed them. The wind was a solid wall, tearing at their clothes and forcing the stinging grit into their eyes and mouths. It was an apocalypse of dust and sound, a world scoured clean by an angry god. Dakota wrapped an arm around Miriam, shielding her with his body as they fought their way through the maelstrom, their heads bowed, their world reduced to a few feet of churning, yellow-brown chaos. They finally reached the cabin, stumbling inside, choking and blinded. Behind them, back in the saloon, the argument raged on, the shouts of the men barely audible over the howl of the wind. Captain Davies, trapped with a room full of angry, fearful citizens, made a decision born not of justice, but of expediency. An hour later, as the storm began to abate, a lone soldier, his face wrapped in a bandana, knocked at their door. He handed Dakota a single, folded piece of paper and left without a word. Miriam and Dakota unfolded it together. It was a military document, filled out in the captain's spidery, impatient hand. It granted Dakota of the Jicarilla Apache temporary, provisional permission to reside and work on the property of Mrs. Miriam Thorne, pending good behavior. It was not a welcome. It was not an acceptance. It was a brittle piece of paper, a grudging truce. He now had the right to exist in the white man's world, on paper at least. But as Miriam looked from the document in his hand to the window, where the air was still thick with dust, she saw the faces of her neighbors watching her cabin through the haze. The paper had changed nothing in their hearts. The contempt was still there. The hatred still simmered. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Her choice was now starker than ever. She could send him away and perhaps, slowly, be forgiven by the town, welcomed back into her lonely cage. Or she could stand by this man, this piece of paper their only shield, and accept a life of love as a permanent outcast. The piece of paper from Captain Davies was not a shield. It was a target. In the days that followed the sandstorm, a new kind of quiet settled over Sanctuary. It was not the quiet of peace, but the cold, hard silence of ostracism. The open violence of the drunken cowboys was replaced by something more insidious, a unanimous and unyielding shunning. When Miriam went to the general store, the other customers would fall silent and turn their backs, waiting for her to complete her transaction and leave. Mr. Henderson served her with a clipped, grudging efficiency, his eyes never meeting hers. The whispers no longer followed her. They preceded her, a wave of silent condemnation that parted the way before her. The provisional permission slip had, in a way, made things worse. It had legitimized Dakota's presence, which made him an object not just of fear, but of deep, simmering resentment. He was no longer just a rumor. He was a legal fact, a permanent thorn in the town's side. They could not drive him away with rocks and fists, so they would try to drive him away with the crushing weight of their collective hatred. Miriam and Dakota continued their work on the small homestead, but the joy had been leached from it. The mended fence was no longer a symbol of their partnership, but a fragile boundary against a hostile world. The flourishing garden felt like a defiant act in a land that wished them barren. They were safe within their small property line, but they were prisoners. Every evening, as the sun set, they would watch the distant lights of the town flicker on, a constant reminder of the world that had utterly and completely cast them out. The choice, Miriam realized one evening as she watched Dakota sharpening an axe by the light of the fire, was not really a choice at all. The paper had not given them a place in this world. It had only clarified that they had no place here. Staying was not an act of courage. It was a slow suicide of the spirit. She could not ask him to live under the constant barrage of silent contempt, nor could she endure it herself. Her home was no longer this cabin, this patch of dirt haunted by the ghosts of her past and surrounded by the specters of a hateful present. Her home was the quiet, steady presence of the man sitting before her.
"We should go,"
she said softly, the words falling into the quiet rhythm of the axe stone. Dakota stopped his work and looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the firelight. He saw no fear there, only a weary resolve. "To the mountains?" he asked.
"To anywhere that is not here," she replied.
The decision, once made, brought a surprising peace. The next morning, Miriam walked into town for the last time. She went straight to the general store and told Mr. Henderson she was selling her property. He was taken aback, a flicker of something unreadable, surprise, relief, in his eyes. He offered her a ridiculously low price, a fraction of what the small homestead was worth. She accepted without haggling. She wasn't selling land. She was purchasing their future. They took very little with them: a few blankets, a cast-iron skillet, an axe, a rifle, and the small bag of seeds from their garden. As they walked away from the cabin for the last time, Miriam did not look back. She could feel the eyes of the town on them, watching from behind curtained windows as the widow and the Apache disappeared over the rise, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. With every step she took, she felt the oppressive weight of Sanctuary falling away. They walked for 3 days, heading west, toward the jagged, blue-hazed peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Dakota moved through the wilderness with an assurance that was as natural as breathing. He found water where the land looked barren, read the signs of the animals, and knew which plants were good for eating. For Miriam, who had only ever known the tamed, hostile grid of the town, it was like learning a new language, a language of stone and sky and wind. He led her to a place that seemed blessed. It was a small, sheltered valley nestled at the foot of the mountains, a place the desert had forgotten. A clear, cold stream, born from the snowmelt high above, tumbled over smooth, gray stones. A grove of ancient cottonwood trees offered shade, their leaves whispering in the constant, gentle breeze. The air was clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. Here, the silence was not empty. It was filled with the music of running water and the rustle of life. Here, they began to build again, not to mend, but to create. They chose a spot on a gentle slope overlooking the stream. Dakota felled young, straight lodgepole pines, his axe swinging in a powerful, efficient arc. Together, they peeled the bark and notched the logs. It was slow, arduous work, but it was a labor of love and creation. Their movements were a silent dance of partnership. She would brace a log while he sawed. He would lift a heavy beam while she guided it into place. They built a small, sturdy one-room cabin, chinking the gaps with a mixture of mud and dried grass. They built a stone hearth that drew perfectly, its smoke rising straight and clean into the vast blue sky. This was a different kind of life. It was stripped to its absolute essentials: shelter, water, food, and each other. Their days were governed by the sun and the seasons, not by the judgment of others. They planted a small garden in the rich soil near the stream. Dakota taught her how to fish, how to set snares for rabbits. She taught him the simple pleasure of her freshly baked bread, cooked in the skillet over the open fire. Their evenings were the most precious time. They would sit outside their newly built home, watching the stars emerge in the clear, dark sky, more brilliant and numerous than any she had ever seen. There were no jeering voices here, no rocks thrown in the darkness. There was only the vast, peaceful silence of the mountains, the gentle murmur of the stream, and the comfortable presence of each other. They spoke little, but they had no need for words. They had found their sanctuary. One evening, as they sat watching the moon rise over the jagged peaks, a perfect silver disk in an indigo sky, Miriam leaned her head against his shoulder. The last 2 years, and the 2 that came before, felt like a bad dream, a life that had belonged to someone else.
I still can't live alone,
she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. The words that had once been a cry of desperate pain were now a simple statement of fact, of self-knowledge. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight.
But now,
she whispered,
I'm not alone anymore.
Dakota looked down at her, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached his dark, solemn eyes and lit them from within. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a perfect, seamless fit. Me neither, he said. The seasons turned. The harsh heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The deep snows of winter blanketed their small valley in a profound, peaceful silence, isolating them completely. A world of 2. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. And then spring came. It arrived not as a whisper, but as a riotous, joyful explosion of life. The land, which had seemed so stark and simple, revealed its hidden secrets. The hillsides, which had been a uniform brown, erupted in a carpet of brilliant wildflowers, fiery Indian paintbrush, delicate bluebells, and sunny yellow poppies. The cottonwood trees dressed themselves in leaves of the most tender, vibrant green. The air was sweet with the scent of blossoms and new life. The entire valley, their entire world, was reborn. One bright, warm afternoon, Miriam stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching as Dakota mended a fishing net near the stream. The sunlight streamed down, making the water sparkle and the new leaves glow. The world felt full of a hope so pure and powerful it was almost painful. And then, a flash of movement at the edge of the trees caught her eye. A small figure, no taller than her waist, toddled out into the sunlit clearing, chasing a butterfly. The child, a boy with a shock of thick, black hair and his mother's determined blue eyes, stumbled on an uneven patch of ground and fell with a soft plop onto the cushion of new grass. He didn't cry. He simply sat up, a look of comical surprise on his face. And then he laughed, a pure, delighted sound that was more beautiful than the music of the stream. He was the promise they had never dared to speak, the future they had never dared to imagine. He was the flower that had bloomed in the most barren of soils, a testament to a love that had refused to die. Miriam looked from her laughing son to his father, who had looked up from his work and was watching the boy with a look of fierce, profound love on his face. He caught her eye across the sun-drenched valley, and he smiled. In that moment, in that small, perfect world they had built together, there were no shadows, only light. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you so much for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier. And please share your thoughts on Miriam and Dakota's journey.